You're listening to the Nourished Child Podcast. I'm Jill Castle, your host. I'm a registered dietitian and a pediatric specialist, and this show is about nourishing children inside and out, and I'm hoping that you're all doing very, very well. The kids are home for summer, they're eating, and their feeding of them naturally intensifies. That structure associated with school is definitely looser, and the food options are influenced by heat, outdoor activities, and yes, the good old sweet tooth. My bet is you'll have to find a way to keep structure, boundaries, and reasonable choices in place. And that's why I'm sharing this episode again. Feeding rules that help kids eat better. You're going to learn about 5 feeding rules to help your child eat better. Some of these are intuitive, some not so much. All of them could be helpful to you, though. If you've got time over the summer to dig a little deeper into nutrition and feeding, consider taking my fully revamped program, the Nourished Child Blueprint. You can find it over on thenourishedchild.com. For now, though, I hope you're off to a great summer. I'm taking a little break this summer, hence the replay, but I will be back live next fall. Until then, take a listen to feeding rules that help kids eat better.
Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Michael Pollan simplified food into bite-sized rules in his book, Food Rules: An Eater's Manifesto. He is famous for saying, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. His food rules are things like 1. Don't eat anything your grandmother wouldn't recognize, which basically means look at the labels and the ingredients included in the food products that you're purchasing. Number 2, don't eat anything with more than 5 ingredients or ingredients that you cannot pronounce. Again, a very simple rule. Another rule that he uses is shop on the perimeter of the store. That's where most of the fresh produce and dairy products and fresh meats and other protein options are located. I will just add, though, that in the middle of the store, there's some great options too, like whole grains and canned beans and canned fish and tuna. So you can also find great foods in the middle of the store, but one of his rules is to shop on the perimeter of the store. Another rule he uses is enjoy meals with the people you love. Who can argue with that? I completely agree with that. And another example is don't buy food where you buy your gasoline. That's kind of a funny one, but it's true. There's a lot of unhealthy options at the local gas stations. So it doesn't mean that you can't get something healthy there, but if you're trying to simplify and follow Michael Pollan's food rules, these are some of the examples. In a speech he gave to CDC researchers, Pollan has been quoted as saying, quote unquote, "The French paradox is that they have better heart health than we do, despite being a cheese-eating, wine-swilling, foie gras gobbling people. The American paradox is we are a people who worry unreasonably about dietary health, yet have the worst diet in the world." End quote. I believe what Pollan and so many others fail to address, especially when it comes to children, is the feeding part. With kids, how we feed them matters just as much as what we feed them. I talk about this quite a bit in my TEDx talk, and if you haven't viewed that, it's on YouTube and it's also on the front page of my website over at jillcastle.com. I go into great detail about where we get and have gotten off track when it comes to educating parents about food, feeding, and child development. I think part of our nation's health problems start very, very early, at a really young age, and they are related to, I believe, a lack of knowledge in feeding and child development. Part of being good at feeding our kids is knowing how to parent around food. I teach this in my program called the Nourished Child Project, and I also teach it to professionals in my course called Food Parenting Pro. Why do I teach these things? Because after 27 years of being a pediatric dietitian, I know parents don't get this information early or often enough. And as a result, mistakes happen. Kids don't grow up as healthy as they could be. They're challenged with medical issues related to food and eating. And some of them are not growing up with a healthy relationship with food, their bodies, or themselves. I chatted with Heidi Schuster about this problem, the problem of growing up and ending up as an adult with an unhealthy relationship with food, body, and self in my last episode, which was number 60. Being good at feeding your child requires 3 key things, in my opinion. Number 1, knowing what to feed them. And that really highlights food, nutrients, and the balance that you strike on a day-to-day basis. It's also being good at knowing how to do it. So how do you feed your child well? And that includes things like your feeding structure, the boundaries that you set up around food and around eating, and whether you offer your child choice or not. And then the third thing that is required in order to be good at feeding your child is an understanding of your child's development and how that developmental stage interfaces with your child's eating. So it's a big topic. It's broad. It's wide. I talk about it all the time. I infuse those 3 components in nearly everything I do. But today what I want to do is unpack how you can use feeding boundaries. That part 2 point that I just covered, the knowing how to do it. A subset of that was boundaries. I want to talk about that with you today. Or, to be similar with Paulin's lingo, we'll call it feeding rules. He says food rules, I'm going to say feeding rules. I'm not a huge lover of the word rule, but if you can keep in mind that whenever you're feeding your child, there has to be a level of flexibility and patience involved, that will help you understand and really soften the word rule a little bit more. I'm going to try and cover how you can be flexible with the feeding rules I'm going to be outlining. So 5 feeding rules that help kids eat better. I've boiled down 5 rules that I teach to my clients and I use in my own home. I'm sure there are more. And if you have feeding rules that you use, I'd love to hear them. You can comment on The Nourished Child on Facebook or in the comment section of the show notes for this episode over at jillcastle.com/061. Okay, let's get into feeding rule number 1. Kids should ask before taking. So as a child, I learned to ask before taking anything. Food, money for the candy shop down the street, a sweater from my mom's drawer. I had to ask before I took anything. And it is sort of a traditional way to approach raising children and even feeding children today, but I have found it to be very useful, and I've carried on that tradition with my own children. They are very good about asking. I've taught them it is a way to be respectful, and when it involves eating, especially when it occurs off the typical eating schedule, asking first has been a really good policy to help me monitor what my children have been eating throughout the day. And so I encourage all my clients to implement this feeding rule so that kids should ask before taking. The opposite of asking first is a child who helps himself whenever he wants to and who opts for whatever he wants to eat. Odds are this child is overeating and making poor food choices. So remember, as a parent, you are in the position of setting these rules, these feeding rules or boundaries, if you will, that teach and help your child to be well nourished from his food choices to his eating frequency. So parents are the nutritional gatekeepers. You've probably heard me mention that before. If you've read Fearless Feeding, we talk about nutritional gatekeepers in that book. You let the food in and you monitor what and how much your children are eating. So having your child ask first helps keep you in charge. And equally important, when your child asks first, you are better able to monitor his eating. Feeding rule number 2. The kitchen is closed between meals and snacks. So for some of you who've been avid followers of my blog, you know that I wrote a blog post, I think it was back in 2010, called The Kitchen is Closed. This has been sort of a cornerstone of what I stand for, a hallmark of what I teach nearly every parent I interact with. I'm a huge believer that closing down that kitchen between meals and snacks and opening it up during meals and snacks is hugely effective at helping children regulate their eating. It literally helps children separate eating from other activities of the day. And it encourages them to eat within the meal and snack time frames you've planned. So obviously, a closed kitchen means there is no eating, there's no food access, there's no grazing. And oppositely, an open kitchen means it's time for a meal or for a snack. So that ebb and flow that happens during the day of opening the kitchen and closing the kitchen can really support your child's rhythmic appetite. And on a side note, sometimes parents will say to me, well, I live in a home where there's an open kitchen concept. I have no doors. Folks, this is not a literal interpretation of closing the kitchen. I am not asking you to install doors on your kitchen so that you can close them. No, this is a figurative interpretation. So it is literally just making an announcement. The kitchen's closed. It's not open for snacks. It's not open for meals right now. You have to wait until XYZ time and the kitchen will be open. I encourage all families, as I mentioned, to close that kitchen between meals and snacks. This is a super simple feeding rule, and it can help really curtail grazing. It can help support your child's appetite regulation, that is, eating when they're hungry, stopping when they're full, and ultimately, it can help prevent excessive, mindless eating. While it sends a clear message to children that eating occurs on a schedule, it also places the onus on you to stay on top of meals and snacks. You can't really get away with skipping or delaying meal times or snacks. It isn't fair to your child, and it makes it hard for him to follow the feeding rules and keep his appetite in check. So both sides need to cooperate. While you're setting boundaries around the kitchen and closing it and opening it, you also have to step up and make sure that you're creating meals and snacks that are nutritious, they're satisfying, and they're happening at a predictable time throughout the day. Reasonable times that coordinate and correlate with your child's physiological likelihood of having hunger. Whenever I see a family whose children have open access to the kitchen and food, I know this feeding rule particularly is something that will help improve the whole family's eating and nutrition. So let's move on to feeding rule number 3, and that is meals and snacks are predictable. So this is really related to number 2. You don't have to be rigid about the timing of meals and snacks, but you do need to be sort of structured with a schedule. And that set schedule helps build a predictability and rhythm for your child with regard to eating. And that predictability and rhythm helps your child feel more secure. And just to kind of give you a touch point on predictability, especially in young children, think about preschool. When they go to preschool, talk about a predictable schedule. Preschools are classic for creating routines and predictable activities that happen during the time that children are at preschool. They come in, they take off their shoes, they take off their coat, their hat, their gloves, their mittens, they hang them up. Then they go to creative time and they sit down and they color. And then it's snack time, and then it's reading time, and then it's nap time. Then it's time to go outside and play and put on the shoes and the socks and all that good stuff. So it's the same predictability and rhythm that you want to create with your meals and your snacks. It helps children know what to expect, and knowing what to expect brings security. It brings a calmness to them because they're not guessing when the next meal is or when the next snack is. They know when it's going to happen. And you, as a parent, are going to be that rock star who is going to show up with those meals and snacks at those predictable times. You'll want to be flexible with that structure or that schedule with your meals and snacks, but you don't want to be too loose. That is, you want to allow some wiggle room around the timing of meals if you need to, but you don't want to be unpredictable or too late. I usually like to see families keep meals and snacks within a 30-minute time frame around the usual time. So for example, if lunch is supposed to be at noon, but you need to be flexible because of an appointment or somebody's taking a longer nap, you could do 11:30 or 12:30. So you can create a half-hour window on either side of your usual time. I always would recommend that if you are delaying lunch, that you give your child a verbal explanation and alert him so that he knows what to expect, and give some sort of simple explanation as to why things are a little bit delayed. Remember, kids like to know when they can expect to eat and generally what will be served. So if you're not one who plans a menu for the week or who thinks through your day and has sort of those food items lined up for meals and for snacks, I would say, and I would advise you to consider trying it out. It helps you tremendously because we're so busy these days that really understanding and knowing what you're serving throughout the day not only helps you, get closer to the nutritional needs that your child requires, but it takes the guesswork out of what you're going to make. And if you're somebody who waits to the last minute to decide what's for dinner, you know how stressful that can be. And you know that sometimes, at least, those meals don't turn out to be the best balanced or the healthiest. So planning ahead can be tremendously helpful to you, but also to your child. If you need help in this area, I'm going to put a link in the show notes to this new meal planning guide called 52-Week Meal Planner, the complete guide to planning menus, groceries, recipes, and more. It's written by my friend and colleague, Jessica Levinson. I actually had her on the show a few episodes back, and she did come on and talk about meal planning. And I think you'll find that show very useful as well. I'll include the show note links in the resources section for this episode. So just head over to the show notes at jillcastle.com/061 to find that link to Jessica's episode on the Nourished Child. And I'll also include the link to her new 52-week meal planner. Basically, when kids can see what's on the menu, they seem to relax a bit about meals. And I've seen this over and over and over in the families that I work with. When they start to post what's happening for the week in terms of meals and snacks, the kids are like, oh, okay, cool. That's cool. I like that. I like that. Now, you might have a child who protests certain items that you've included on the menu. You can reassure them that they can have input on food selection the following week. A weekly menu allows your child to know what's up and allows him to settle in and just get used to what's coming down the pipe for the week in terms of meals and snacks. And as I will discuss a little bit later in another food rule, it's perfectly fine for children to have input on that meal plan and on those menus. but you don't want them to have last minute input and you don't want them to have all the input. So there's a balance that we'll strike, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, we've covered 3 out of the 5 feeding rules. Number 1, kids should ask before taking. Number 2, the kitchen is closed between meals and snacks. Number 3, meals and snacks are predictable. Now, as I mentioned before, I have a bonus feeding rule for you, and it might be the most challenging one of all to implement. So hang tight. I'm going to get to it, and I really hope you stick around to hear it, because it is a rule that I discuss with a lot of families, and nearly every family's eyes get really wide, like, really, Jill, you're going to ask me to do this? So stick around. I'm interested in telling it to you, and I'm also interested in hearing what you think of it. But let's talk about feeding rule number 4 first. So feeding rule number 4 is parents are in charge of food and feeding. Now, that might feel like a little bit obvious based on the former rules I've just discussed, but I want to acknowledge that it's not always easy to stay in the role of nutrition leader. It's not always a rewarding job. Oftentimes it's a thankless job, and it's a hard job. It's taxing. I know, I do it as well, and it's not always fun. And you may think because I'm a nutrition professional that I love doing meal plans and I love doing grocery shopping and I love cooking, but the truth is, I don't always. And sometimes I really struggle with meal planning, and I struggle with getting myself to the grocery store and thinking ahead about cooking and how I'm going to work that in to a busy day. So you're not alone. Everybody struggles with this, is my finding. But anyways, it's not easy to stay in the role of nutrition leader, but it is important to fortify the feeding rules you have set around nutrition and food. So sometimes children need a reminder of who's in charge. When kids are running the roost, feeding almost always gets off track. Eating can be all over the place, poor food choices are made, and both of these are a recipe for poor nutrition and overeating. Now, on a little side note, if you're a short order cook, then you're not really in charge. Don't worry, I've got a free cheat sheet to move you away from this counterproductive reality, and I'll include that link to get that download in the show notes, jillcastle.com/061. I say that on the side because I meet a lot of parents who have turned into short order cooks when they never ever imagined that that would happen to them. It's a slippery slope. But what I do know is if that's happening on a regular basis, you're not the one in charge of food and feeding. Your child is. When your child turns into a teenager, it becomes even more important to steer the proverbial nutrition boat with your hand on the helm. Don't be hesitant to have conversations about Ellen Satter's division of responsibility with your child or teen. Cover your role as provider. Let your child know their role as consumer. The division of responsibility, as a reminder, includes roles for the parent and the child. The parent is in charge of choosing the menu items, the location of meals and snacks, and the timing of it all. The child is in charge of whether he will eat and how much he will eat. All right, let's move on to feeding rule number 5. Kids can have an opinion and choice within reason. One of the cornerstones of being a good feeder is to give your child a voice when it comes to food preferences and amounts. When kids get to choose between graham crackers and saltines or oatmeal and eggs, they feel empowered and in control of themselves. This simple act builds autonomy, a cornerstone in child development linked to the building of self-determination, independence, and self-esteem. On your part, it will take patience and flexibility because mistakes will be made and minds may change. But in my opinion, encouraging autonomy through reasonable choice is worth it. Some parents make the mistake of giving too much choice, and that makes things harder on everyone. Would you like milk, orange juice, apple juice, or water? That's overwhelming to a young child, and maybe even for an older child. Keep it simple. A good rule of thumb is to offer 2 or 3 choices within the same category. The younger the child, the fewer the choices. For example, would you like sweet potato or corn with dinner tonight? Or you could say for an older child, do you want me to make a plate for your late dinner? Or do you want to gather it yourself from the refrigerator when you get home? Or another choice, reasonable choice, before you leave for school, do you want a smoothie or toast with peanut butter? The bottom line is offering a reasonable choice gives children the indication that you remain in control of feeding them, but that they also have a voice, some small slice of control of the outcomes, which may help all children be more cooperative. Okay, just to recap the 5 different feeding rules we've covered. Number 1, kids should ask before taking. Number 2, the kitchen is closed between meals and snacks. Number 3, meals and snacks are predictable. Number 4, parents are in charge of food and feeding. And number 5, kids can have an opinion and a reasonable choice. Well, now let's get into that bonus rule that I mentioned earlier, and that is kids can refuse food. So this may be one of the most challenging feeding rules to wrap your head around. This whole idea or fact that children have the right to say no, the right to refuse food, the right to pass on a meal or a snack. Yep, that's right. Kids do not have to eat. I know this might be triggering the very parenting nerve that tells you it's your job to feed her. It's your obligation as a parent to make sure she is nourished. And it's the only reward you get for slaving over a hot stove to make her exactly what she likes. But the truth is, it's her body. And if you are to fully trust her ability to regulate her eating, or at least respect her developing ability to know when she is hungry and when she's not, you need to let her refuse to eat, or eat less than you think she needs to eat. If she makes a mistake and doesn't eat, or doesn't eat enough, but is truly hungry, she needs the opportunity to learn and experience the consequences of not eating enough. This could look like going to bed without dinner. She's not going to starve, most likely, and you'll have a fabulous opportunity to reassure her that she'll have a nutritious and delicious breakfast in the morning. Then you do your part and plan a hefty breakfast to satisfy your child's appetite. Now, I want you to use your parenting instinct on this one, because some children I do know will refuse food and refuse food and refuse food over and over and over again because they are extremely picky, or they have ARFID, or there's an adverse dynamic going on around the feeding environment. If this is the case, you need more professional help for your child. This is not something that this particular podcast will be able to address for you. But I want to say that for the most part, most children will, if they eat less than what you think they should, or they decide not to eat their dinner and they go to bed on an empty stomach, they are unlikely to have a negative experience other than feeling more hungry. This could also look like refusing an off-schedule snack. So yeah, your child might decide they don't want a snack and come to you 30 or 45 minutes later saying that they want a snack. And yeah, when you tell them they can't because the kitchen is closed, they might have a meltdown. But you can reassure that child when the kitchen will be open next, and then take the opportunity to plan a nourishing and satisfying snack for him or her. Now, if this whole idea that your child can refuse to eat and he actually has the right to refuse to eat, if you're feeling uncomfortable with this idea, that's okay. Take some time to play it out in your mind. Anticipate how your child might react to this. Weigh the outcomes of this learning opportunity versus coming to the rescue with a second dinner option, a late night snack, or extra afternoon snacks. Think about your long-term plan. Where are you headed, and how are these seemingly little daily decisions getting you there or taking you away from your desired destination? For the record, in my own home and with my own kids, I've told them the kitchen is closed and they have been refused food, even when they say they are hungry. They've learned to follow my feeding rules. Some of them have also gone to bed without a substantial dinner, at their choice. I've reminded them of the feeding rules. I've reminded them that the kitchen will be closed after dinner and that there would be no food until the next morning. And they've stuck with the choice to not eat or eat very little. I respected their choice and held fast my feeding rules. They learned important lessons, and I feel I have helped them cement the ability to be in charge of their own bodies, to show my respect for their decisions, and to stay true to my long-term feeding plan for them. You know your child better than anyone else, so I would just ask that you give thoughtful consideration to the feeding rules you have in your home and whether they are helping your child. Are they setting your child up for future success with eating? Are they aligned with your long-term nutrition goals? Let me know your thoughts about this episode and the feeding rules that we've outlined over at jillcastle.com/061. I hope you liked the show. As a reminder, the best and most helpful way you can help the Nourished Child podcast grow and reach other parents is to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Android. That's it. Go to the podcast app on your iPhone, click the search icon, and type in The Nourished Child. Click on the cute little icon, and then click on the subscribe button to the right. It's super simple. For Android, you can find the Nourished Child podcast on Stitcher and Google Play Music. Last, I just want to remind you I have a library of useful programs and guides to help you raise a nourished child, and they are all on my website over at jillcastle.com. Head over there to find online learning programs, ebooks and guides, podcast episodes, free articles, and free printables, all geared to help you nourish and nurture your child inside and out. I'm thrilled you joined me today. I know you are helping your child just by listening to this podcast. Whether you have a rock-solid feeding rule system lined up or you are working on them, make sure you give that child in your life, big or small, a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.